नेक्स्ट सेसन अर्बन प्लानिङ एन्ड डिजाइन थिममा रहेको छ डाक्टर तेज कुमार कार्की सर जो यस नेपाल अर्बन डायलग 2020 का चेयर हुनुहुन्छ उहाँले मोडरेट गर्नुहुनेछ ओभर टु यु सर
Thank you. Thank you, Sinuji. We have two presentations on urban planning and design from 9 to 10. So the first presenter is Mallory Batches. She will be talking about new urbanism in the United States. I hope she is preparing and sharing the slides, and she can continue.
Thank you, Dr. Karki. So, hello, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Mallory Batches. I am Director of Strategic Development at the Congress for the New Urbanism, a national nonprofit in the United States. I'm an urban designer with an architecture background and a certified planner in the US. And I'm going to speak to you today about the US. I've been asked to speak about the US perspective of design and the future of planning and of urbanism and the US's experience in this. So I grew up in the American city of Chicago. It's the third largest city in the United States. Chicago is where the skyscraper was invented, and it's where many architects became famous: Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, Mies van der Rohe. And it's perhaps most famous for having 4 square miles burned to the ground, and the city was then forced to rebuild huge portions of what is today downtown Chicago. This drawing here is from Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, which was a vision for the fast-growing city that was recovering from a fire tragedy. And it did so first by holding the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, and it continued to grow from a population of 300,000 when the fire ravaged in 1871 to a population of 2 million in just 38 years. And so I believe that this exemplifies the American approach to planning, which Daniel Burnham said himself, quote, "Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble, logical diagram, once recorded, will never die, but long after we are gone, be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency." And so that is what US planning has done for the 244 years of our country's existence, and in particular in the past 100 years since the Plan of Chicago. And it's maybe best represented by what those in the US who sell homes have successfully coined the American dream: a family in a house with a yard and a picket fence surrounding it. And that is what US planning has tried to give the citizens of our country for 100 years. And planning continues to give this to us. This New York Times article is from last year, documenting the extraordinary changes that portions of the country have continued to experience in the past decade, as you can see. And this is what those examples look like on the ground. On the left, a development in Texas, outside of Houston. And on the right, a development in Florida, outside of Orlando. And you might note that they are almost impossible to distinguish by their land pattern, by their architectural form, by their relationship to the environment. They're extremely typical of a large portion of US land development patterns over the last 50 years, and you can find examples of these all over the country. But the US has not always planned in such segregated and monotonous and unsustainable and unadaptable ways. In 250 years, between these two settlements here, the US has clearly changed its patterns. And lessons from that change are what I want to speak to you all about today. It's critical here for me as a white woman of European ancestry to acknowledge that what is today known as the United States and the European colonization of this land that began in the 16th century is not at all the beginning of human settlement on this land. And it shouldn't be considered with priority over that of the indigenous peoples that the Europeans forcibly colonized. The earliest human settlement on what is today the US is referred to as Cahokia. It's an extraordinary settlement of Mississippians that contemporary to its peak at about 1,000 years ago, was rivaling the population of London. And I am currently speaking to you from the city of Savannah, which was settled along the Savannah River, first by the Wali, then the Choctaw, then the Creeks, and then the Yamacraws. It was established as a colonial city in 1733, and it was founded and initially planned by James Oglethorpe, the first governor of the colony. And this image here from 1889 resembles much of what still remains today with the city of Savannah. And the industry has changed and evolved. The uses occupying the buildings depicted here have come and gone. And new buildings have been built in place of some of these over time, but the scale and the pattern and the intensity that is described here remains the built fabric of the city to this day. The most unique aspect of that fabric is the pattern of 22 squares that are the organizing system for the majority of Savannah's historic downtown. This plan that James Oglethorpe laid out when he colonized the city utilized this distinctive street network with repeating squares of residential blocks, commercial blocks, and small green parks. The result is a rational planning approach, one with philosophical roots in the Age of Enlightenment, which was happening at the time of the city's conception, and one that has been replicated and adapted in many ways around the US and beyond. Central to the success of the pattern are these public squares, which provide space to gather, to rest, to gain relief from the hot, humid summers, which are very long in Savannah. We are still at the tail end of summer right now. And for the buildings that face them, whether they are private residential lots or public civic lots, there is an amenity of these beautiful public spaces directly adjacent to the property. The lessons of social equity and civic virtue manifest in city planning, such as the Oglethorpe Plan, can be found 100 years later in the work of Ebenezer Howard of the UK with his well-known book, Garden Cities of Tomorrow. And while there are many critiques of aspects of this sort of, quote, utopianism, the approach took particular root in the US, and town plans by Frederick Law Olmsted, Clarence Perry, and the suburban resettlement pattern, suburban resettlement program towns that President Roosevelt's New Deal prompted all followed this sort of pattern. The theme of utopian city further evolved in the US with the proposal for an ordered metropolis and Le Corbusier's design for the Ville radieuse. And again, we see the influence of this ideology in US planning, of the city as a machine, as a system, and as a series of individual functional parts working together. We see this influence particularly in the prioritization of efficiency of movement and in the separation of means and use that came to dominate settlement patterns in the US for much of the past century. A critical tool that allowed cities to determine their desired outcome came in the form of what we called zoning codes, beginning with the zoning resolution of 1916 in New York City, but throughout the next decades and honestly throughout the last century. The expansion of land use regulation as a strategy to control the height, massing, and disposition of the built fabric of cities coincided with the growth of city planning as a professional pursuit and municipal responsibility in the US. Not all planning outcomes during this period of time were welcomed by the citizens of these cities. Most famously, perhaps, is the battle between New York City journalist and activist Jane Jacobs and planning commissioner for the city of New York, Robert Moses, over a number of planning proposals that citizens, including Jacobs, rejected for the damage that these proposals would do to existing communities. And further still, this influence of efficiency was used by cities in the US for racist and classist results. They're best exemplified by the so-called, quote, urban renewal that you see here of the 1960s and 70s, when cities addressed disinvestment and segregated white and wealthy neighborhoods from others through massive transportation and housing development projects that destroyed the social fabric and economic health of once thriving racial and economic minority communities in the name of, quote, progress. But following the failures of urban renewal in the 1980s, we saw US planning begin to understand the social science of cities, the ways people move through and temporally inhabit and personally experience urbanism, and being critical to improving the Valley White in New York City